Hi there, grief growers. Not sure what the heck is going on in terms of trying to go live on Facebook. So we are here on YouTube Live on a very private, special, unlisted channel. I'm getting ready to share the link with all of you in the Grief Growers Garden. So give me one moment as I get this to everyone who's coming to watch. Let's see if that works. Alrighty, so after some brief technical snafus, guys, welcome to Coming Back's third podcast anniversary. I am intensely grateful to my Google Calendar for reminding me that Coming Back has officially been around on the podcast airwaves for 3 years now, since 2017, because in the midst of quarantine, it's like, what is time anyway? And so to be reminded that, oh my gosh, Coming Back was actually started on this day 3 years ago in 2017 is really, really special. And I always do something like this when Coming Back's podcast anniversary comes around, to answer questions, to talk about previous episodes of the show, to remind you, to remind me, to remind all of us why this show exists in the first place. And so shout out to my Google Calendar for reminding me that today is Coming Back's podcast anniversary in the midst of quarantine, when time is an enigma and we really have no idea what's happening in the world. For those just joining the call, there is a live chat on the right-hand side if you'd like to share either your lost story with us, how long you've been listening to Coming Back, maybe your favorite episodes of the show, and I'll be here for a full hour. I know I'm late getting onto the call, but I'm going to stick around for a full hour here to continue to take your questions, to hang out, and to celebrate the thing that is coming back. I brought a non-adult celebratory beverage. So I'll be cracking that open here in a minute, but let me just check in the group and make sure that everybody's getting this message that we're live here. Yeah, looks like it posted okay in the Facebook group. I have no idea what's happening. Maybe those who are more tech savvy than me will one day figure it out. But every time I tried to go live on Facebook, it said error connecting, or your camera is not supported by this browser. And I did all the tech support assistance that I possibly could through a quick Google search, and that gave me nothing. So we'll try again in the future to connect. I had no idea that my laptop would not pick up the possibility of Facebook Live. So welcome to our call. I kind of want to share a bit of Coming Back's origin story with you. I lost my mom to breast cancer very unexpectedly in December of 2013. And in the 2, 3, 4 years after her death, I spent a lot of time searching. I spent a lot of time looking for answers, resources, a path, or a map to find my way back from life after loss, because I'd never experienced anything at that level before. At this, I am just taking the foundation out from underneath you. I am destroying everything you know to be true. I am ripping apart everything that has ever made safety, security, certainty, surety in your life. And so to take all of those things away in the aftermath of loss, and then to try and find my way back to the world again, was really what I was trying to do. And one of the biggest resources that I leaned on, partially because I didn't have to read it, and partially because it was free, was podcasts. And I found, through the stories of others and just even listening to other people who had made it back from losses that totally turned their lives upside down, it transformed me. It transformed the way I saw the rest of my life, because I think I saw the rest of my life after loss as hopeless, or inevitably sad, or somehow lacking because my mom was no longer here. And so I had this perception of my life in the world where I just didn't believe that it was possible for me to come back to life. after loss again. And it's not because I was special, but it was because my loss itself was so drastically great. Got a little hanger on my flower crown. Lori says, I'm here. Lori, thank you so much for joining us on the call today. I'm hoping everybody can see this here. If you're able to join us on YouTube, and please comment here on the YouTube chat. I know some folks are commenting on Facebook. Maybe I'll pull up both windows side by side so I can see everybody's comments all at once, because I'm on the YouTube channel right now. So if you're commenting on Facebook, I can't see you. It looks like Rahel says, love the flowers. Yes, I made this flower crown in honor of Chicago Pride a while ago, probably 3 or more years ago. And it's something I like to do on the side. These are faux flowers. I didn't construct this and put this together while in the midst of quarantine, but it's something I really enjoy doing because it's sculptural and it's hands-on, and it's, yeah, there's like a tactile event to it. Yeah, reminds me also to have more color in my grief journey. Me too. Although sometimes in grief, there's this phenomenon that happens that I love, that What's Your Grief calls an inability to see rainbows. It's almost as if when we experience devastating loss, that the color drains out from the world, like the whole thing goes into grayscale. And so even if people around us are seeing something really beautiful and really spectacular, it's almost like we're blind to it, but it's the impact of it doesn't touch us. It's like it hits this plexiglass shield that's way out in front of us. Yeah. So I more or less started a podcast because a lot of people told me I should. I was doing a lot of reading on life after loss. I was doing a lot of listening on life after loss, and I would post these things on my private Facebook back in the day when I just had a personal one, and people would say, "Hey, this is good. I've never thought about grief this way before," or "This inspires me," or "This motivates me," or "This makes me want to reach out to people who are grieving and speak to them differently." And I'd never had that experience before, where people wanted me to take what I was saying and what I was doing and make it bigger than myself. That had never happened before. And so I actually started doing something similar to this. I started doing Facebook Live videos back in 2016. I had attended an event back when we could go places. I'd attended an event back when we could go places and run into this coach who literally crossed the room. We'd never seen or met each other before. And she literally crossed the room, looked into my eyes and said, whatever you're thinking about, you need to use your voice. And I had been tossing around the idea of doing a podcast for, I don't know, probably 6 months or so. I'd looked into the equipment and microphones and, you know, what frequency to release it on and how long it should be. And all these other decisions I was making, but I was waiting to pull the trigger because I didn't, I just didn't feel ready. I just didn't feel 100%. And in that moment, I was like, okay, I'm going to have to do it anyway, even if it's not at 100%. And so the very next day after I'd met this coach, I went live on Facebook for the very first time. And the very first video I did was called The Truth. It's worth it to grieve. And even now I get chills talking about it because I think that sentiment of like, it's worth it to have this experience. I think so many people try to avoid or resist or push away grief for so many reasons, and to show up and say my truth, that it is worth it to grieve, to have the experience of grieving, because it changes our lives and makes us see so many things about ourselves and reminds us of the depths of our love, was really powerful to me. And the mic quality was terrible and my voice cut in and out and the camera was old. And it didn't matter. I think I only ever had 10 people watch the thing, and it's up on YouTube somewhere, my very first video that I ever did. And so for a while on Wednesdays, I would regularly release some kind of Facebook Live. One of my favorite ones was actually inspired by a friend who told me during a conversation that their parent never let them have pets growing up because one day the pet would die. And I was like, oh my gosh, we need to stop stopping our children from falling in love, because one day that love will die. One day that love will end. I think that's the wrong message to send. And so I did a whole video on stop teaching your kids not to fall in love, because one day the love will die and the love will end and you'll be heartbroken and not like the way you feel. And that's not the right reason to not fall in love. And we should allow ourselves to fall in love, and we should allow ourselves to be broken, because that's the experience of being human. And so I came on and did another video about that. And probably about 5 or 6 months after I started doing Facebook Lives, enough people approached me and said, hey, I would subscribe to this or I would listen to this if it were released in podcast form. And I was working in a real estate office at the time, and one of the guys who actually hired was like, "You've got a voice for this. You've got a voice for radio. So why don't you produce a podcast of your own?" And so it was really a matter of enough people telling me that they wanted something like this and my desire to produce something like this. It's like the two things were married together and they joined from opposite sides to be like, there's a need for this, there's a desire for this, there's a calling for, hey, we like this and we want you to make it. And then my own desire for, I like this and I want to make it. And those two things kind of merge together to create this experience of a podcast. And I'll tell you, I mean, the way I've podcasted has changed so much in the 3 years that I've worked on Coming Back. The thing that's changed the most, I think, is the amount of weight or the amount of research that I put into every episode. When I first started out, I was researching vigorously every single guest that came onto the show. I'd know their backstory. I'd know all their social media handles. I'd know all the books they'd written and the things they designed and the projects that they were working on. And some of that served me because I was able to ask these really informed questions. But I saw, especially at the beginning, how that took me away from their lost story. It's almost like I was so focused on making it a good interview or a good podcast that I would step away from the lost story and focus on what I needed to do to make it great. And now literally when I interview people, I'll just sit in a room with a pen in my hand and a notebook and just close my eyes and listen to them speak and hear the emotion in their voice and allow them to take me on the journey of where they want to go in their lost story and not try and interject so much with, so what about this project or this book, or I saw this quote here and there. And of course I bring up their work if it's resonated with me, but the way I interview has changed so that the speaker is allowed to take us on their own journey instead of me trying to artificially construct the journey that we should all be on. And now I leave it to myself to do the opening and closing credits, and everything that happens in between is this very organic flowing. We start here, maybe we'll go back and visit this. We're going to jump way ahead into the future. We'll come back and look at this later. And it feels a lot more conversational. It feels a lot more organic. And there's opportunities too that I didn't create in the beginning of Coming Back, where I get to share my own lost story or the things I'm working on with clients or the books I'm writing or the things that I'm producing as well. And so it becomes this experience of we are co-creating a conversation on life after loss, which is a really neat harkening back to the day I came up with the title for Coming Back, Conversations on Life After Loss. It becomes a two-way street instead of a questioning or a grilling. It looks like, I hope this is Rahel, R.R. Okoko. I love this name. I heard a lot about loss from you. What do you think about death itself? I'm so scared, this idea to never see daylight again. Within my grief process, I try to find a new approach to death itself. I have a hunch that you're speaking here on mortality awareness. I think this is a really scary thing that comes up in life after loss, where we suddenly become aware of the fact that we are going to die ourselves. And I actually wrote a blog about this probably 2 or 3 years ago because I spoke about it in an interview with Joshua Black, who produces the Grief Dreams podcast. And that might be one for you, Rahel, to check out. And Hartman. And it happened very neutrally. It was not an experience that I had that scared the crap out of me or kind of put me in a state of shock. But I was cleaning my apartment and I was dusting and putting things back on the shelves. And I was holding these objects in my hands. I think they were little ceramic birds. But I put them back on the shelf and I just thought, like offhand, I was like, one day I'll never touch this again. Like one day I won't be able to hold this again. One day these will become artifacts of my life as opposed to things that I actively own because I'm alive versus being dead. And it reminded me of the shift that objects took after my mom died. It wasn't just like her pen and her journal and her Bible and her favorite picture in the kitchen. It was, she has died. And so now these are the only physical remnants of her. She has touched them for the last time because she has died. And so to have that realization as I was just like offhand cleaning my house was, wow, really bizarre. And this sense of becoming mortality aware fills you with a lot of, or can fill you with a lot of fear. A lot of it's very grounding. Is like, yeah, one day we're all going to die. There's a certainty or like almost a security in it. Like no matter what happens, we're all going to die anyway. So there's a bit of a laughable nihilism or stoicism in it of like, yeah, it's a fact that we're all going to die. But there can also be a lot of fear. And Rahel, for you to say, I think a lot about loss. I think a lot about death. I'm afraid of of never seeing daylight, of never breathing again, to inhale and to exhale and to not have that experience anymore, to see flowers or to hang out with your family or to pet a cat, to have these human experiences that we have right now. For me, I think they bring more richness to those experiences right now because I know one day I will not be able to have them. And so almost this, I don't know if you've ever done wine tastings or food tastings, but if you've ever done them on purpose, to show up, to sit at the table, to have your silverware ready, to have the glasses and the plates and the forks and the knives in front of you, and to have somebody with you who can tell the story about what you're eating, and to put it in your mouth and really savor it. The word I'm getting at is to savor, and to let it dissolve or to let it become something different, and to really have the five senses experience of, I am here right now in this moment with this thing, having this experience, making this memory. Like, that's when mortality comes up in my picture. When I think about death, that's how I start to behave in my life. It's really something that puts roots down for me in the ground of, because I will never experience this again, I want what I'm experiencing now to feel so much richer. And so putting blocks and barricades on things like screen time is really important for me because I want to be present. It's gotten a lot harder with quarantine because screens are how we stay connected to each other. And so it's been a lot harder for me to put the screen down and let go experience the world. But there's something that happens when I do. And I'll tell you, Rahel, if you haven't listened yet to the episode of Coming Back that I did with Alua Arthur, called, I believe it's called Going with Grace, or finding grace in the room, or creating grace in the room, something with grace. But Alua Arthur, A-L-U-A, she's a death doula, and she actually does a lot of work in her work about mortality awareness, and it even leads people who are still living in something called death meditation. And so they can approach death without actually dying and learn how to meet it and greet it and enfold it into the experience of their life, opposed to thinking of it as some abstract thing that's going to happen sometime later on in the future. I think that's a really good question, is like, how do I perceive death? I think I'm afraid of it happening too fast. For me, there's a lot that I want to do. There's like a lot that I want to get done before I die. Very driven in a way, crazy driven. And there's a lot I feel needs to be said before I die. And so, especially when I released Coming Back, but even more so when I was writing Permission to Grieve, my motivation for writing that book was, if this doesn't get out of me before I die, that's going to be my biggest regret. And so I actually used mortality and death as a motivator of getting shit done. I look at my to-do list, I'm like, will I be okay if I die without this getting done? And if the answer is yes, I can put it off for longer. But if the answer is no, that's how I know where my heart lives and where my drive lives and where my passion lives, is because if this doesn't get done before I die, I will severely regret it. And using death as that fire under my butt to really know what my values are and to know what I prioritize, so that I can do the things that need doing, and I can put off the things that don't necessarily need doing before my death. Yeah, absolutely. Rahel also says, you have this calm voice and presence, which are so special. Yes, people have told me they fall asleep listening to episodes of Coming Back, and I feel like that would be insulting to other podcasters, but to me, it's one of the biggest compliments I can receive, because I think that in the aftermath of loss, I was looking for something that kind of felt encircling or enfolding, and somebody actually wrote a review of Coming Back on Apple Podcasts that says, this podcast is like a warm blanket to wrap myself in. And I'm like, wow, like that's one of the coolest things I've ever heard. And I don't do anything to alter my voice to speak for Coming Back. This is my normal speaking voice. I don't have like a podcast voice and a real life voice, aside from the fact that in real life I talk a lot faster. Which is tricky to do on a podcast, because that's something that causes a lot of complaints. But I was classically trained in voice from the time I was 6 until the time I was 14. And so there's a lot of diction and enunciation and all this, like, keep your diaphragm upright as you're speaking, so that the voice comes out in a way that's clear and makes sense to the people who are listening to it. A lot of music and musical theater training went into this. And it's funny because I believe personally that nothing we do in life is ever wasted. I think that a lot of people, especially right now in the midst of quarantine, who are losing their jobs or being forced into different vocations right now because of the pandemic, who think, going to college was a waste, or having Being in a relationship was a waste. Starting to date right before the pandemic hit was a waste. Car was a waste, or all these other decisions that you make that can feel like a waste of time. All these other things that we feel are scarce. And I firmly believe that the things that we do in our lives help inform our future. I have a degree in design and marketing from college. I have used that once to get a job out in the world. But the rest of the time, I've used it to design the covers of my books and to design T-shirts for the podcasts that are live on my website, or the stickers that Patreon supporters get sent, or all these other things, or like business cards that I use for my own business. And so it's like I have a degree in it, and I'm not using it to be the primary source of my income, but it's come in major handy in all these other areas of my life. And I feel the same way about my vocal training. And so even now, if you feel like something you're doing is a waste of time or a waste of money, if it's something that you want to be doing, keep doing it, because it's going to inform what happens in your future. Let's see. Lori says, "Hey Shelby, when does resentment subside? I'm still angry after 2 years of the suicide of my daughter." Yeah. I don't know that resentment subsides. I think this might be an issue of changing the goal instead of necessarily changing our actions. I think resentment gets incorporated just like grief does. Like for me, resentment will always be a part of my story. I don't know. It depends on how long you've been listening to Coming Back, but you might know that my biggest source of agony, my biggest source of pain in the loss of my mother is not just the fact that she died, but the fact that she died in the middle of an argument. She and I were fighting about my sexuality. I came out of the closet 3 years before she died, and she was a very religious, very Christian woman in life. God was her thing. And she firmly believed that me as a queer person, I was going to hell. I was going to be permanently separated from the rest of my family for the rest of my life. And she and I fought for years and years leading up to her death. The last 3 years of her life, from the time I came out until the time that she died, I came out December 22nd, 2010. She died December 26th, 2013. Almost every interaction that we had was so painful. And we weren't always fighting with each other. I wasn't always spitting Bible verses at her, and she wasn't always spitting religion and her attempts at conversion or love, or it's just a phase at me. We were always actively fighting, but there was this, it's so hard to put into words, but it's like every time I saw her, my chest would ache because I didn't know whether or not she really loved me anymore. Like there was an uncertainty in my body and my spirit about if this was true, if this could make her so angry at me and just so distant from me. Was there really any love in this relationship anymore? And to have her die without knowing the answer to that question has been the biggest source of resentment in my life. I was so angry when she died because it wasn't fair that she died before our conversation was finished, before we came to resolution, before she came around, before I acknowledged the importance of religion in her life and all of these other really heavy things that we never got to iron out between us. And people say, yeah, there's a normal separation between, 20-somethings and their parents and all this other stuff. But like, it felt so much deeper than that because we were reckoning with my fate in the world. I didn't believe that hell existed. I still don't. I don't believe that people get punished for what they do in life. I think if that's true for you, go right ahead. You will manifest what you believe to be true in your life. But for me, I just could not believe in a God or a universe that wanted to hurt any of us and that would punish us for being ourselves, especially for something as benign as love, for as good as love. And in her mind, I think religion was something that saved her, that brought her out of a really dark place. And this is something I've done a crap ton of work on in my life. But I see religion now as the thing that saved her. And so for me to be queer and coming up against the thing that literally saved my mother's life was one of the biggest fights that she ever had to get in her life internally. Was God is the thing that saved my life. God is the most important thing to me, and my daughter is queer. How do I reckon with the fact that she will no longer be with us when she dies? And that she was fighting tooth and nail for us to be together after we all died. And seeing it from that perspective, as opposed to my mother hates me, my mother doesn't love me, my mother doesn't understand, my mother doesn't want me to be happy. all of these other stories that I was telling myself in the aftermath of her death helped me change. Not necessarily my emotions towards her, because there is still resentment there. I'm still angry that she didn't come around fast enough, or that she just couldn't see my side, or that she didn't know how to be open, or didn't have the vocabulary to just accept it instead of fighting me. But it's almost like resentment has grown from just being this pointy, sharp rock, and now has these, it's like someone's come along and bubble wrapped it. It's like resentment was this really sharp object that was lodged in my chest, and I've done so much work on my grief, and therapists have helped me, and coaches have helped me, and you guys have helped me, and other grievers have helped me so much to like bubble wrap this thing so that the resentment doesn't go away. I can tear apart the bubble wrap and really dig into it, and I do on some days. I live in that resentment on some days, especially when I see people at events like Pride or things that celebrate queer, especially queer parents and their kids, queer kids and their parents. And I'm just so angry. I'm so bitter that was our life together. And that it can't be changed. That's really what I'm angry about, is that it can't be changed. What happened was permanent. And I sense the same for you is true too, Lori, in that this cannot be changed. We can't go back and fix this. We can't make it right. There's no more that can be done. And so there's a lot of resentment of, you did this to me. You left me here. I don't understand. I wanted more answers. I wanted resolution. I wanted things to be different. Like that ache in you is so strong. And I think that's where resentment comes from, is wanting things to be so different, and then being angry that they couldn't be and they can't be anymore. It's like full stop, end of transmission. Cannot go back and change any of this. And so to be angry, especially about something like a suicide, there's so many reasons to be angry. And I think continuing to look at it, examine it, kind of, Rob Bell talks about turning the gem, so you see all the different facets of it, and seeing too, especially in the case of suicide, that it wasn't about you. I think when resentment is the sharpest for me, it's when I'm taking it personally. It's when I believe that my mother truly hated me. It's when I believe that she saw me as wrong or broken or defective, and I could never be made right. When she was disappointed in me. When I see her anger and her inability to understand as something that was directed at me, not her personal belief systems, her faith, her desire as a mother to protect me from everything in the world. When I take it personally that she did not approve or appreciate or honor my sexuality, especially before her death, that's when it hurts the most, is when I see what she did as an attack on me. It's been a really hard place to get to, and it's still a place that I'm getting to. It's something that's like, it's like a destination that's out here in the future, and I'll never reach it, but I'm always walking towards it. And I hope that makes sense to you. And I know I'm taking quite a while to answer this question, but I think resentment is something that's so hard in grief. Yeah. Let's see. Next question from Lori is, what does the sign fart around say behind you? Oh, yeah. This is one of my favorite quotes from Kurt Vonnegut. It says, let me tell you, we are all just to fart around, and don't let anybody tell you different. And it makes me laugh, and it reminds me that despite the fact that there's all these things I want to do when I die, nothing is nothing is sacred, nothing is important, nothing is dire, nothing needs to happen. You know what I mean? We're here to interact with each other, to make stuff, to get together, to communicate, to build things, to destroy things, to make relationships, to lose relationships, to read books, to throw books away, to listen to podcasts, to not listen to podcasts, and then we all die. It's very much we're here. It's like lighten up. It's like we're here to fiddle around. We're here to explore and to see what we can make of this human experience in the short time that we have it, and then we're done. And so, especially when I get really down in the dumps about something that I'm creating, or something that I just can't find the right words to, or an episode of the podcast that just isn't coming together the way I want it to, we're just here to fart around. Like it takes the weight of the intensity of things off for me. And I actually, this quote was up in the bathroom of my favorite coffee shop here in Chicago, where I wrote most of Permission to Grieve. And the first day that I was there to write and I went to use the bathroom and I saw this quote, I said, I need that in my house, because that is helping me lighten up about this so much better. It's like, do the thing, but do it imperfectly. And you have permission to do that. And so I released Permission to Grieve, and it doesn't sound exactly how I wanted it to sound, but I don't know that anything I make ever quite will, because there's like the perfect vision in my head, and then there's like what my human self is actually able to create. And that's not a detriment on me, but it's like in our heads, I'm sure all of you know, that we can create perfect worlds in our minds, but we don't live in perfect worlds in reality. And so to make things in the world that are imperfect and put them out there and love them anyway and just let ourselves fart around is really important to me. There's a couple of other things on this wall that are important to me. The up here, the birds on a wire is actually an abstract of the Chicago flag. There's 4 stars, 4 red stars on their bellies, and then they're all in blue. Sitting on a wire, and pigeons are like a part of Chicago culture. Of course, top left here is my Golden Girls, my all-time favorite TV show. A lot of grief motifs in that show, but I started watching that after I lost a major friend group in high school. And there's actually episode 10 of Coming Back is all about grief on the Golden Girls, and it's one of my favorite episodes to go back and listen to. It's one of my first ones. The tulips are from a trip that I took to Seattle, and then this over here is really nice postcards that I've received from fellow authors, guests of the show, you guys as grief growers, like just nice things that people send me. And so every night I go, before I go to bed, I'll read what's above my head and just know that there is support beyond myself. Because as a one-woman podcast, it's really easy to believe that I'm doing it alone. Because in some ways I am. But in other ways, I know that every time I speak into the microphone that somewhere, someone out there is receiving it. Yeah. Rahel says, I listen to your podcast to fall asleep in the evening to calm down when I'm nervous because of my grief, and it works. Yeah, it does. And I don't necessarily fall asleep to podcasts. I have a Sound Machine app that I use on my phone, but I know from listening to a lot of audiobooks, like just how soothing it is to be told a story by someone else and to be in the presence of somebody else's voice that's soothing. It almost, I think it does. It doesn't almost, it shifts your energy. It moves you to a different state of mind or state of being, because you're asked to shift your focus from what's happening in here to what you're listening to in here. And so it forces your brain kind of to do something else. I speak in my online program, Life After Loss Academy, about putting a boulder in the road. When we talk about anxiety in the program, it's like anxiety goes like this, but then, and it's almost like a horse wearing a rut in a pasture. It's like, I'm just going to walk in circles. But to put a boulder in the road of that, it's like the horse has to stop and go in a new direction. And so to listen to something like a podcast, or to interrupt your grief with an audiobook, a podcast, something that's listened to, can actually shift how you're feeling in the moment, because you're changing the input that your brain is receiving. Yeah, absolutely. Rahel says, I'm so sorry to hear that about these arguments with your mom that you felt bad about. I can relate to that because I feel guilty so quickly. Yeah, and I do too. It's almost like the instant my mother died, guilt set in. It's not been a gradual process. It's something like as soon as she died, because that was the end of all of our communications, it's like guilt happened instantly. It's like she died and then I was guilty. I'm laughing about it now because it happened so fast, but in the moment, oh my gosh, it was heavy. It's like, not only do I have to reckon with her death, but now I have to reckon with all this guilt. And I would just feel all these like bricks stacking up on my back. And there's still some things I feel guilty for. I think a lot of, and I spoke about this with Cheryl Strayed when we did our live broadcast on Sunday, with guilt, part of it is forgiving the other person, but most of it is forgiving ourselves for being the people that we were back then and for not being able to know any better. And this goes for, we've had people on the show who talk about, if I had known better, my child wouldn't have died. If I had known better, I would have had a better relationship with my mother. If I had known better, I would have been able to resolve things with my spouse. If I'd have known better, we would have gotten different medical care. Like, there's so many different stories, but they all start with, if I'd have known better. But the thing is, we couldn't, and so we have to forgive ourselves. Absolutely. Rahel says, my last phrase to my mom was that I love her before she died the next day. And today I carry it like a blessed present, that I do not feel guilt in regards to the last words to my mom. Yeah, and last words are a cause for guilt as well. I think that final sentiments are a big deal. I think partially because movies and television have made that so, that last words somehow have more weight than any other words that we say, because they are the last words. And I think there's a bit of truth in that. But also, too, the last words you say to the person you love aren't the forever end of all of your communication. I firmly believe that, period. And that communication is very much allowed to continue. That's why for every episode of Coming Back, I sign off the way that I do, because I think last words are important in a way. And when I was creating Coming Back, I was like, I knew I wanted to have some kind of sign off. I knew I wanted to have some kind of blessing that would help people listening feel like they were loved, they were seen, they were understood, they were heard, they weren't alone, that they had a place in the world and that they had found it. And to say, I see you, I am proud of you in the work that you're doing, like no matter how small, and I love you, no matter who you are. We've never met. Most people who listen to Coming Back, most of my clients have never met me. We are all working digitally, virtually. We're all engaging in the big giant pool that is the internet. And so to have never met most of you and to love you still, regardless, feels really, really special to me. And to have created the tagline, because even through grief, we are growing. I was like, the thing that came to me one day, that's truly a gift that the universe bestowed upon me that I never asked for, but also I am so honored to have received, because it's something that literally informs everything that I did. Because in the aftermath of my mom's death, I didn't want to know that the future was going to be good. I just wanted to know that I wasn't going backwards. And I think telling myself or hearing from the universe, whoever, whatever entity sent this to me, because even through grief, we are growing, was like I was like, there's my bedrock. There's my foundation. Even if tomorrow feels a lot worse than it did yesterday, I'm still learning something, seeing something, doing something, having a different experience than I did the day before. And even that tiny bit of new information is growth. Even if I'm like, wow, I'm really depressed today, and I wasn't yesterday. And for a lot of people that can feel like going backwards, I'm like, wow, I'm learning what it feels like to be depressed. I didn't know that yesterday. And so to take it from this place of measurement of somehow I'm going backwards and saying, oh no, I'm just learning more as I continue to live, and that being perceived as growth instead of failure was really, really powerful in reframing for me. And so closing every single podcast that way has been one of my, like, that's a thing that stays. That's a permanent fixture of Coming Back, is to say, because even through grief, we are growing. Yeah. Lori says, I've been listening for 2 years. And thank you for listening for as long as you have, because I've been making the thing for 3 years. But I always love knowing people are out there in the world listening. It's important. And I wonder, I'll pose a question your way now, grief growers. What would you like to hear next? I know that every now and then I'll get an email from one of you suggesting a guest, and those are enormously helpful. And sometimes I can get them on, and sometimes I can't. And sometimes we'll get suggestions for topics as well. And so I'll try and pursue someone who actively speaks on something like that, or I'll do my own kind of like rendition of what that's like. In life after loss, I can offer wisdom to the best of my ability, but I wonder what you might like to hear next on Coming Back. And maybe if you suggest it, I might be able to tell you an episode where it's already happened. Yeah, let's see. I'll pop over to the Facebook group for a moment, see if anybody said anything else. Yeah. I know that something that's come up a lot, at least in my mind, has been doing more episodes on divorce and diagnosis changing your life as opposed to death. Because when I market Coming Back, when I tell people what I do, I tell them I work with 3Ds: death, divorce, and diagnosis, because they're like the 3 biggest losses that change our lives. And this is not to outrank any other losses, but these seem to be the most frequent. And also maybe the heaviest ones that people carry: death because it's so permanent, divorce because it's so heartbreaking, and diagnosis because it's so life-changing. And I did some episodes, at least when I first started Coming Back, that were just divorce focused or were just diagnosis focused, and nobody died. But as the years have gone on, and as I've gotten guest suggestions, they've focused a lot more on what we do when people die, how we come back to life after loss when people die. And I find that when people think about grief, that's what they think of first. They think of somebody dying. And so I suppose it's a really good entry point, but I've wondered recently, pardon me, if we should be honoring divorce or diagnosis more than we currently are on the show, because they are important and they do really affect people's lives, and they do cause grief. They are a cause for grief, and sometimes even more so than when people die. I've worked with clients in the past who, I mean, their biggest loss was a chronic diagnosis that would affect them for the rest of their life, despite the fact that they had lost many people over the course of their lives. And I know people for whom divorce was more painful for them than the death of somebody that they loved. Probably, I mean, because in some circumstances, death is expected. Like, we're all going to die, but are we all going to get divorced? It's not always an expectation that people hold in their mind. So when it happens, sometimes it can be far more shocking. And this is very individual to everybody that it happens to. Yeah. Yeah. I think one thing I've never talked about publicly is the logo design for Coming Back. This literally has informed all of the branding I've done for my website, the t-shirts, Permission to Grieve, like literally this color green that I chose one time kind of circumstantially for Coming Back has been the color with which I have painted everything that I do. You know, it's coming from Shelby Forsythia if it's this specific color of green. And it's a hex code that I will probably forever have memorized when graphic designing. It's like you can plug in 6-digit hex codes when you're applying colors to a page. And I didn't really do it on I don't think I stumbled on this on purpose. I think this is a green that I just loved looking at. And when I put it in the background of the Coming Back logo, I said, that's exactly what I want people to know. I want them to know there is growth here. As a florist, I'm still really obsessed with plant motifs, as you can tell. And because even through grief, we are growing in the Grief Growers Garden, and all of these images of there are processes at work here, even if we don't understand them, even if we aren't people actively watering the plants, something is still growing here. It has been really special and really helpful for me, in aligning grief with nature is something that I love to do. And so in designing this logo, I was like, I think I really want it to be green. And then I needed some element of growth to come in. And so shifting the letters so that Coming Back was aligned to look like this stem that was coming out of the ground was really, really cool. I mean, all of this happened while I was on a train, going back and forth to see the woman that I was engaged to at the time. And when I stumbled on it, it was very much, I mean, even getting chills now, it's like chills ran through my whole body. I was like, this is it. This is the thing that needs to be out in the world. And some part of me kind of regrets not putting anything with grief in the title, because it makes me less searchable online. But I knew that I wanted to talk less about the thing that happened, less about the loss, and more about the life after. Because I think that so many programs, and this is not a slam at any other grief programming, but so many grief programs talk about the loss that happened and the events leading up to the loss. And my question and my exploration in Coming Back was more about, but how do we survive? How do we come back? How do we not recover so much perfectly, or get back to normal, which I think is a lot of things that people advertise about grief. But how do we return to our lives again now that this has happened? With this information in tow, it's a lot about incorporation, but it's a lot about participation. Like, how do I learn to participate in my life again when I really don't want to, when I never thought this would happen? Yeah, absolutely. Rahel says, I've got a book called Guilt Makes Sense. In German, the word make means make and power at the same time. So true. Guilt puts our world in order again. If I did this, then I could have avoided death. Ooh, and I like that parallel of that make and that power mean the same thing, because guilt is really a powerful energy, a powerful entity. And there's this illusion, you're right, Rahel, of if I could just negotiate this, I could align the planets, I could make it so that this never happened. And I think guilt is a fantastic illusion. Guilt is a story that we tell ourselves of being all powerful when we're really not. Guilt is this beautiful illusion of, if only I had the power, if only I had the tools, if only I had the money, if only I had the information, if only I had the energy, then this would be perfect. It would be made right. And there's this, it's a perception of perfection and a perception of all powerfulness. And we know that both of those are not true in our existence and our lives as humans. And so guilt is really a reckoning with the fact that we are not all powerful, we're not always in control, and that we're not perfect. And we can't be. We can't be. It's not anything that's our fault. We just can't. We can't be. Yeah. Lori says, I appreciate that my daughter identified as LGBTQIA. I thought my acceptance of her identification was enough, but there were other demons at play. Yeah, and there often are. There often are. And I hesitate to say that acceptance is not enough, because I think for a lot of people it is. But there's often so much more going on in the minds, the hearts, the bodies, the psyches, the souls of queer people than even we are able to discuss in public spaces or private spaces, or even intimately with our family and friends. There's a dialogue, I think, that so many queer people have that straight people just don't, because we live in a heteronormative world. And there's an episode of Coming Back about this too that I did with J. Mace III. And the whole top of the show, the whole, 10, 12 minutes at the top of the show was devoted to the unique grief of being queer. And I will say that there is a privilege of being queer in the United States of America, where there's no death penalty. But there is still very much, especially on the part of trans people, and this is why I love speaking to J. Mace III, because he identifies, he is trans, and to speak to him about what it's like to be under the queer umbrella as somebody who's trans, and how that affects your idea of safety in the world, and how that affects like whether or not you feel okay. It's a privilege to be straight. It's a privilege to live in that world. And there is a fear. I am quote unquote lucky in the sense that I quote unquote appear straight by like gender norms, whatever society has put in place. But there is a grief of announcing it. I have often wondered if it will impact my work, if I've lost followers because of it, or other socioeconomic, political, cultural beliefs that I have and hold or am. Yeah, it's just really interesting to think about. There's a lot of rabbit holes about it, which is why it's something I continue pushing at or prodding at on Coming Back. I feel like that is the story that I'm telling over and over again. And Sally Tisdale says in her book, Advice for Dying Corpses, which we're all dying corpses, that we tell stories over and over again to make sense of them. Stories need to be told over and over and over again. And so the story of my queerness and the lack of acceptance on the part of my mother is the story that I'm telling over and over and over again, to try and figure out, where it goes, where it belongs, how it affects my life, what it means. And I may never have entire answers. Again, it's like that goal that's way out here, and I'll never reach it, but I'm always walking towards it. It's like it's coming into view. And maybe I just will never know everything. And grief, so much of grief is figuring out how to be okay with the fact that you can't know everything. And that's really hard. It's another admission of our humanness, like Rahel was talking about, admitting that we aren't all powerful, admitting that we aren't perfect, admitting that we can't do it all, admitting that we can't save ourselves and save others as well. Yeah. We've got about 12 minutes left on the call. I wonder if there's any other questions, grief growers, that I can answer for you. And I'm actually really looking forward to posting this in the Grief Growers Garden group to see what else others have to say, and to celebrate the 3rd anniversary of Coming Back. I really don't know how much longer I'm going to be producing this thing, and that's not a threat by any stretch of the imagination. But I never thought it would get here, and also there's so much else I want to create in the world. I will say something that I've done, a project I've worked on in the midst of quarantine, is creating merchandise for the show. So if you go to shelbyforsythia.com, there's a new tab that says shop, and you can get shirts with like the Coming Back podcast logo on it. And if you're a Patreon supporter, you know that we're going to design a special t-shirt that says, because even through grief, we are growing together, and then release that in the shop as well. But there's other shirts that, say, let's talk about grief, or grief is holy, your grief matters. There's a lot of things on there, sentiments that have been echoed on the show, that I was like, this needs to be a shirt. Like, we need to be able to wear this and approach other people, or have other people approach us, and to open up the conversation on grief. And I know right now it's really tricky or maybe inconvenient to buy merchandise because who's going to see it? We're all sitting around, for the most part, we're all sitting around in our pajamas right now, kind of waiting for lockdown to end. And if you're not sitting around in your pajamas and you're an essential worker, thank you. We appreciate everything that you're doing out in the world, and we know that your work is its own kind of grief right now, and a grief that only you will hold, and that none of us really will ever truly understand because we've not lived in your shoes, we've not lived in your space, in your world, and so we thank you for that as well. But when we're all out in the world again and we can wear t-shirts that have words on them and start conversations from less than 6 feet away, I'd love to see you in one of them, Grief Growers. I have one at my in my dresser drawer right now because I proofed them. I got them sent to my house just to see how they looked, and they look pretty dang good. So I'll be posting a picture of one of those on Instagram here in a couple of days so you can see what it looks like. Yeah. Let's see, other stories I can tell you about coming back. There's so many. It's always an adventure getting guests to come onto the show or being pitched guest on the show. I didn't start being pitched until about 6 or 7 months after the show was live. And the longer I've produced the show, the more pitches I get. And pitches are like when somebody pops into my email inbox and wants to be on the show. And so I filter through quite a few. And only doing anywhere from 36 to 40 episodes a year, I have to be really careful about who I choose. And not careful as in cautious, but careful as in deliberate. I'm really, how do I phrase this? I'm really centered on what stories do we need to tell? What have we not talked about yet on the show? What needs to be elevated, and what order are they coming in as well? So I tried my best not to put 2 similar losses back to back. Like you won't find 2 episodes of loss of a spouse, butting heads back to back on Coming Back. I really try and make them different from each other. And as much as I can, although this is harder, to find people of different backgrounds to share their stories on the show. I do try and find a lot of men. I do try to find a lot of people of color. I do try to find a lot of people who identify as queer to showcase their voices and their stories on the show, because they are not voices that are elevated in the grief space. Unfortunately, the grief space is very female and very white, which is what I am. And so so to bring people on the show with voices and stories and perspectives that are different from my own is really, really important to me. So always, if you have a guest suggestion for the show, somebody that you'd love to hear from, Shelby at shelbyforsythia.com, and I will do my best to reach out to them and see if they want to come on. Some people say yes immediately. Some people find it in their spam email 2 years later and then come on the show. And so I really do my best to get them on there and to see what happens. And it's something that I'm looking forward to continuing to produce. I think that in the aftermath of my own loss, reaching for these stories was something that changed my life and changed my grief. And knowing that they were out there, even if I didn't actively listen to them every single day, but knowing that I had access to stories like this, instrumental, supremely powerful in helping me come back to life after loss again. So thank you all for being here to celebrate 3 years of coming back with me. I love this. I love being in conversation with you. I love hearing your questions, hearing your thoughts about grief and loss, because they're also different, because all of our loss stories and all of our humans and all of our pain points are so vastly different. And so for as much as this is something that I'm putting out into the world, the feedback that you give me helps me know kind of what to put out next. It feels very, very generative. It's like, as I am feeding, I am being fed. I think I said that on an interview with Rob Bell once about this grief work. And it's something that's very, very true for me, that as I'm doing this work, I also feel like there's work being done for me, kind of underground, under the surface. And it feels really cool to continue to draw up from that. Yeah, season 9 of Coming Back right now, 3 years. And going strong. What's also been amazing, and something I'll probably write a blog piece about one day, although that day is not today, is the fact that podcasts are like the new realm for grief. They're like the new medium for grief. Just in the past 3 years that I've been doing this, the amount of grief podcasts or podcasts related to loss or addiction or suicide or divorce or diagnosis has like tripled, quadrupled, septupled. And it's been amazing. Like, I don't see the podcast space necessarily as a competitive one. I see it very much as a shareable space that we're all inhabiting together, because we all have different voices and we're all telling different stories. but the podcasts about grief have grown. There are so many more than there used to be. And every time I put something out into the world and I'm trying to get when I pitch other people, pitch other podcasts to be on their shows, every time I search grief, I see one I haven't seen before. And that's pretty wild. I'll share some of my favorites. My OG favorites, ones that I leaned on immediately after my mom died, are Dealing with My Grief with Darwin Dave and the Grief Dreams podcast. And I love Grief Dreams because just about everybody I know or speak to has had a grief dream of a loved one after they've died, but not everybody gets to talk about it. And Dealing with My Grief is full of like witty observations and comparisons of grief is like a chess game. Grief is like basketball. Grief is like quarantine. And so there's these experiences that Darwin kind of parallels to each other and makes these beautiful metaphors about what grief is and what it means. And I also just really love the sound of his voice. Other new ones that I've been turned on to are Mindfulness and Grief, the podcast with Heather Stang. And she has got some amazing tools for really getting close to or getting into a relationship with your grief and reframing it as something that's companioning you as opposed to something that you're fighting against. I was recently on that show, I think about a month ago, to share my own tips and stories, but that show's a really good one. Other podcasts about grief. I will be on one soon called Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. Hopefully the profanity is not an issue for most of you, but it's an explicit and maybe perhaps a bit dark or raunchy show about what grief is, because it's something that sneaks up on you. It's something that can take you by surprise. And to have that be a part of the experience is really aggravating at times. Of course, Terrible Thanks for Asking is a great one. It doesn't have grief in the title, but it talks about all of these different kinds of losses. And so death, divorce, and diagnosis are huge on there. Some of my favorite episodes have not been about death at all. They've been about eating disorders or mental health conditions or living with children with autism or special needs, and they've just been so good. And conversely, there have been episodes about surviving mass shootings, about being victims of a hit and run, about losing people that we really, really love in the world. And Terrible Thanks for Asking is just incredible. I love Nora McInerney, and her books are phenomenal. I loved It's Okay to Laugh, Crying is Cool Too, and her most recent one is called No Happy Endings. Very, very good books. And they're broken up into these little essays about life after loss. And I think it's a really great format for if you kind of just want a little bit, if you want to dive in and then dive out at times and not feel like you have to keep up with the linear progression of a whole story. They're really good to read. Other grief podcasts that I love, something that's a little more hands-off grief, although dives in sometimes pretty deep, is Death, Sex, and Money with Anna Sale. And about every third or fourth episode, it will be an episode about death or someone dying. And the other episodes will be about sex and money. But it's essentially an exploration of taboo topics in the United States specifically, but the world over. And there have just been some phenomenal episodes about what it means to die or a complication after somebody dies, especially financial issues, or especially wanting sex or not wanting sex after somebody dies. And it's really cool. And every now and then they'll do call-in episodes too about, the pain of student loans or dating in quarantine or all of these other kind of death, sex, and money related ideas. And you can call in and share your ideas. I believe it's an NPR or an American Public Media produced podcast. And so it's very, very well done. The sound is. Other episodes or other podcasts about grief that I love. I'm like, here, let me look in my phone while I'm hanging out with you here. Oh, a great grief podcast that I listened to recently. It's short. It's like a serial podcast where you can listen to all the episodes in like less than a day and then you're done. It's called Dying for Sex. And it's about this woman who has breast cancer and it's terminal. And so she breaks up with her garbage husband and has a bunch of sex before she dies. And so it's very explicit. So don't listen with children in the room or people who listening to sex. But this exploration of being in your body and having physical experiences, knowing that your body is going to die, wow, it's such a great show. It's such a great show. Let's see, other ones that I've listened to recently that are really, really good. Or speak about grief. You might be interested in Brene Brown's new podcast called Unlocking Us. There's a couple episodes on grief. She did one recently with David Kessler that I've yet to listen to, but I imagine it's tremendously good, as well as Glennon Doyle about reclaiming ourselves after we've been kind of socialized to be something else. by the world, and it runs parallel to grief. It's not necessarily grief itself, but runs parallel to it, and I really do love that one as well. Yeah, a lot of grief podcasts out in the world, and I'm glad that there are, and I'm glad that I'm also one of the ones out there continuing to make one. Yeah, um, I I am so honored to have spent this hour with you, grief growers, celebrating the third podcast anniversary. Say that 5 times fast of coming back. I thank you so much for listening. I thank you so much for sharing with people in your life who really need to hear it, or total strangers. I've heard stories of people sharing this with people while they're on vacation or in a lift or at a restaurant. And somebody just starts talking about grief and wants resources, and somebody's like, just go listen to Coming Back. It's free. You'll find something you need there. And I can't tell you how much that means to me. If you're looking for something to do to support Coming Back today, I would really appreciate it if you left a review, whether on Apple Podcasts or on Stitcher. Those are the two places that you can listen to Coming Back, where you can also leave a review of it. There's some really good ones there if you're looking for inspiration as well. And if you'd like to financially support the show, that's really helpful too, on patreon.com/ShelbyForsythia. And people who support the show, they get all kinds of things. They get a shout out on the show. You may have heard me read people's names at the end of the show before. If you pledge at a certain dollar amount, you get a free copy of my book, Permission to Grieve, as well as stickers, merchandise from the show. You get a lot of behind the scenes looks at what it's like to create the show, but also the opportunity to be a part of like book launch teams that I put together in advance, or like right now we're designing a t-shirt together that's going to be released that says, because even through grief we are growing, and they get to vote on a final design. And so that's something that Patreon supporters get to do. So if you can support financially, especially right now, $1 a month, $3 a month, it's really helpful. It literally helps me keep the lights on for the show and get it out to more people that need to hear it. So anything is helpful. I see you. I am so proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world. And I really love you, grief growers, because even through grief, we are growing. Happy birthday, Coming Back.